chandeliers at La Mer hung like frozen fireworks, each crystal catching and fracturing the late afternoon light into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the burgundy walls. The restaurant breathed wealth with every carefully curated detail, hand-painted murals depicting Venetian canals, marble floors polished to mirror perfection, tables dressed in Irish linen so fine it whispered when touched. The air itself seemed to cost money, perfumed with hints of truffle oil and aged wine, circulating at a precise 71 degrees that suggested comfort without acknowledging the brutal November cold pressing against the windows outside. At table 17, positioned strategically between the main dining room and the discreet exit leading to the kitchen, a woman in a beige cashmere coat sat with the stillness of prey that had spotted a predator. Her name was Nadia Chen, though she'd given the maitre d' a different name when she'd arrived 40 minutes earlier. Her untouched glass of Pellegrino had long since lost its bubbles, and the breadbasket before her remained covered with its pristine napkin, as if disturbing it might trigger some terrible chain of events. Her fingers, manicured but not ostentatious, trembled against the white tablecloth as she watched three men navigate through the maze of tables toward her, their approach as inevitable as gravity. They moved with the practiced coordination of a hunting pack. The largest led the way, 6 feet 4 inches of barely contained violence, stuffed into a $2,000 suit that couldn't quite hide the bulk of his shoulders or the way his arms hung slightly away from his body, the pose of a man accustomed to throwing punches. His face was all angles and scars, with the flattened nose of someone who'd been hit often enough to stop caring about appearances. Behind him came a leaner man, wire-thin but coiled like a spring, his eyes constantly scanning, cataloging exits and obstacles and potential witnesses. The third man, silver-haired and elegant in the way of old money, moved with an administrator's confidence, someone who ordered violence from spreadsheets and considered blood a line item on a budget. Nobody in the restaurant noticed the maintenance worker adjusting the thermostat near the service corridor. His presence was as unremarkable as the wallpaper, a gray uniformed ghost whose function was to ensure their comfort without intruding on their consciousness. The name tag on his chest read E. Hale, though none of the diners would have bothered to read it. They saw the uniform and looked through him, their eyes sliding past as if he were made of glass. Evan Hale had worked at La Mer for 3 months now, part of his regular rotation through the city's high-end establishments. The restaurant was just another stop on his route, another set of systems to maintain, another collection of machines that needed his attention more than the people who benefited from them. At 35, he'd perfected the art of invisibility that came with service work shoulders, slightly hunched to appear smaller, movements efficient but unobtrusive, face carefully neutral to avoid any expression that might draw attention or invite conversation. His hands, as they adjusted the temperature controls, bore the history of a different life. The calluses were wrong for simple maintenance work, too specific, too strategic, placed where weapons training and defensive techniques would leave their marks. A thin scar ran across his left palm, but not from any industrial accident. It was too clean, too precise, the kind of mark left by grabbing a blade to keep it from someone's throat. Another scar, barely visible beneath the gray uniform sleeve, traced the path of a bullet that had grazed him in a place he no longer allowed himself to think about. But those hands were gentle now, trained to fix rather than fight. They could diagnose a failing compressor by touch alone, feel the vibration of a bearing about to fail, sense the temperature variation that indicated a refrigerant leak. They were the hands that braided his daughter's hair each morning, that checked her homework each night, that held her when nightmares about fires and mothers who never came home woke her at 3 a.m. The woman at table 17, Nadia, shifted in her seat, and Evan caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He'd been watching her since she'd arrived, not out of any particular interest, but because his trained eye had noticed the anomalies. She'd requested that specific table. She'd positioned herself to see all entrances. She kept her phone in her left hand, thumb hovering over what he suspected was a record button. She was afraid, but it was a prepared kind of fear, the fear of someone who'd walked into danger with her eyes open. The 3 men reached her table, surrounding it with practiced casualness. To anyone glancing over, they might have been old friends arriving for a reunion, except for the way they blocked every escape route, the way the woman's breathing had gone shallow and quick, the way her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her phone. Miss Chen, the silver-haired man said, his voice cultured, reasonable, the kind of voice that could order a wine pairing or a murder with equal calm. What an unexpected pleasure. We've been looking everywhere for you. I don't know you, Nadia said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You have the wrong person. The large man laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Come now, don't insult our intelligence. You've been asking questions about our employer. Disturbing questions. Questions that suggest you've been speaking to people who signed very specific non-disclosure agreements. The thin man pulled out the 4th chair at the table, spinning it around to sit backwards, his arms draped over the back in a pose of casual menace. "We're here to retrieve some property that belongs to Ravenfield Corporation. Return it, and we can all go about our day. Refuse, and the situation becomes complicated." Ravenfield Corporation. The name hit Evan like ice water down his spine. His hand stilled on the thermostat control, his entire body going rigid for a moment before he forced himself to relax, to maintain his invisible maintenance worker facade. Ravenfield. The company that owned the building where Sarah had died. The company whose criminal negligence had killed 23 people, including his wife. The company that had walked away from prosecution with nothing more than fines that amounted to pocket change against their quarterly profits. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the fire at the Ashford Street boarding house. 5 years since he'd identified Sarah's body by her wedding ring because the flames had taken everything else. 5 years since he'd had to explain to a 2-year-old that mommy wasn't coming home. 5 years of letters to Ravenfield that went unanswered. 5 years of watching them continue their business while 23 families mourned. 5 years of raising Lily alone while the executives responsible for Sarah's death got promoted and received bonuses. In his pocket, Evan's fingers found the cracked porcelain spoon, Lily's favorite from their breakfast set. She'd broken it that morning in her excitement about a science project. Something about phototropism and how plants always grew toward light no matter what obstacles stood in their way. "Like people, Daddy," she'd said, her 7-year-old wisdom shining through chocolate milk mustache. "We grow toward good things even when bad things try to stop us." The spoon should have been thrown away, but Evan had kept it. Partly out of habit he fixed things, even broken spoons, and partly because Lily had tied one of her red threads around his wrist after breakfast, insisting it would keep him safe. The thread came from Sarah's old sweater, the burgundy one she'd worn on their first date, the one that had unraveled in the wash a year after her death. Lily had saved every strand, convinced they held her mother's protection. Every morning, she tied one around his wrist with the solemnity of a priest performing a sacrament. "I'm a journalist," Nadia was saying, her voice growing stronger. "I'm investigating workplace safety violations. That's not a crime. Industrial espionage is," the silver-haired man countered smoothly. "Theft of proprietary information carries serious penalties. We're here to retrieve what you've stolen and discuss compensation for the damage you've caused to our employer's reputation." "You mean the damage caused by letting people burn to death in buildings with locked emergency exits?" Nadia's fear was transforming into anger, the kind of reckless courage that came when someone realized they were already in too deep to back out. Or the damage from bribing safety inspectors to overlook violations that kill people. The large man's hand dropped onto her shoulder, heavy as an anvil. "Careful with those accusations. Slander is also actionable." Evan had seen enough. He pulled the cracked spoon from his pocket and walked toward table 17, his maintenance worker shuffle transforming into something more purposeful with each step. The other diners, lost in their own worlds of expensive wine and small talk, didn't notice his approach until he was already at the table, placing the broken porcelain carefully on the pristine white tablecloth. "Wrong table," Evan said, his voice carrying the flat, uninfected tone of Chicago's South Side. "Wrong day, gentlemen." The 3 men turned to stare at him, their expressions moving through confusion to irritation to dismissal in the span of seconds. The large man's hand remained on Nadia's shoulder, his grip tightening enough to make her wince. "This doesn't concern you," the silver-haired man said, his tone suggesting he was addressing furniture that had suddenly developed the audacity to speak. "Please return to your duties." "The lady looks uncomfortable," Evan continued, as if the man hadn't spoken. "That's my concern." The thin man stood slowly, unfolding from his chair like a switchblade opening. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" 3 men surrounding a woman who clearly doesn't want your company," Evan replied. "Everything else is just details." The restaurant's atmosphere shifted like a weather front moving through. Conversations at nearby tables stuttered to a stop. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes froze mid-stride. Someone's phone appeared above a menu, its camera lens glinting in the chandelier light. The elderly couple at table 12, regulars who came every Tuesday for the early bird special, leaned forward in perfect synchronization, their gossip network already activating. "Listen carefully," the large man said, his voice dropping to a growl that wouldn't carry beyond their small circle. "You're a nobody, a janitor, a ghost who fixes toilets and goes home to a pathetic life. Walk away now, and we forget you exist. Stay, and you become a problem. Problems get solved." Evan picked up the cracked spoon, running his thumb along the fracture line. The break was clean, dividing the bowl perfectly in half, but somehow the piece held together, 2 parts maintaining the illusion of wholeness. Like his life after Sarah, broken down the middle but still functional, still able to serve its purpose, even if it would never be truly whole again. "I fix things," he said simply. "Right now, you're what needs fixing." The large man moved first, his massive hand leaving Nadia's shoulder to grab for Evan's throat. But Evan was already shifting, his body remembering training that 5 years of maintenance work hadn't erased. The cracked spoon in his hand became a weapon, its broken edge finding the precise point on the man's wrist where the median nerve crossed the bone. The strike was economical, precise, not enough force to cause permanent damage, just enough to send the nerve into spasm. The man's hand contracted involuntarily, his fingers curling into a useless claw. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling backward into a dessert cart that had been left too close to their table. Crème brûlée and chocolate soufflé exploded across his expensive suit as he went down, his bulk overturning the cart with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant. The thin man was already moving, his hand going for something at his belt, a knife, Evan realized, catching the glint of metal. Evan's left hand grabbed the linen napkin from Nadia's table, snapping it out like a whip. The fabric wrapped around the thin man's wrist, tangling with his belt and whatever weapon he'd been reaching for. A quick pull combined with a sweep of Evan's foot sent him stumbling forward, directly into the overturned dessert cart where his larger companion was still struggling to rise. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and pastry cream. The silver-haired man reached inside his jacket, but Evan was already there, moving with the economy of someone who'd done this dance before. The thermal receipt from his work order he'd been scheduled to check the ice machine that had been acting up became rigid when folded properly. The paper's edge pressed against the man's carotid artery, not hard enough to cut off blood flow, but enough to make the threat clear. "Your move," Evan said quietly. "But consider that everyone here is recording. Whatever you do next goes viral in minutes." The silver-haired man's eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in the forest of phones that had sprouted from every table. A teenager was providing live commentary to her stream, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. "This maintenance guy just dropped 2 corporate thugs with a spoon and a napkin. Y'all, this is better than any movie. Team maintenance man all the way." "You have no idea what you've done," the silver-haired man said, but his hand moved away from his jacket, empty. "I've stopped 3 men from assaulting a woman in a public place," Evan replied. "Pretty sure I know exactly what I've done." Nadia stood slowly, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. She pulled something from her coat, a small USB drive that she held up for the cameras to see. "These men work for Ravenfield Corporation. This drive contains evidence of systematic safety violations, bribery of public officials, and the cover-up of their responsibility for 17 fatal fires over the last decade, including the Ashford Street boarding house fire that killed 23 people 5 years ago." The mention of Ashford Street sent a murmur through the crowd. Everyone remembered that fire. It had dominated headlines for weeks, the horror of people trapped in a burning building with no way out, the recordings of 911 calls from victims who knew they were going to die, the investigations that had mysteriously gone nowhere, despite overwhelming evidence of criminal negligence. Evan's hand trembled slightly, the only sign of the emotional earthquake happening inside him. Sarah had called him that night, just minutes before the fire started. She'd been working late, finishing a report. "I'll be home soon," she'd said. "Kiss Lily goodnight for me." Those were her last words to him. By the time the fire department arrived, the emergency exits had failed to open, the sprinkler system had failed to activate, and 23 people had died in a building that should have been condemned years earlier. "They've been following me for a week," Nadia continued, addressing the phones more than the people. "They've threatened me, my family, my sources. They want this evidence destroyed before the federal prosecutor sees it on Monday." "These are the delusions of a disgruntled former employee," the silver-haired man said, trying to salvage the situation. "Miss, Chen was terminated for cause 6 months ago and has been harassing our company ever since." "I've never worked for Ravenfield," Nadia shot back. "I'm an independent journalist, and everything on this drive is documented with sources, dates, and evidence that will stand up in court." The large man had managed to extract himself from the dessert cart, his expensive suit now a Jackson Pollock painting of custard and chocolate. His face was purple with rage and humiliation, his paralyzed hand still hanging uselessly at his side. "You're dead," he snarled at Evan. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. A nobody who's about to disappear." Before anyone could respond, a small voice cut through the tension like a bell through fog. "That's my daddy." Everyone turned to see a little girl standing at the restaurant's entrance, still in her school uniform navy jumper over a white shirt that had clearly seen a full day of second-grade activities. Her backpack, covered in hand-drawn butterflies and stick-figure families, bounced as she ran across the restaurant toward Evan, her light-up sneakers flashing pink and purple with each step. Behind her, Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor who watched Lily after school, hurried to keep up, her face a mix of exasperation and concern. "She saw the videos online," the older woman panted. "Someone in her class has an older sister who was watching, and it spread through the school like wildfire. She insisted we come. I couldn't stop her, you know how stubborn she gets. Lily crashed into Evan's legs with the force of a small hurricane, wrapping her arms around him with the fierce protectiveness of a child who'd already lost one parent and refused to lose another. She turned to face the three men, her 7-year-old face set in a scowl that would have been comical if not for the genuine fury blazing in her dark eyes. Sarah's eyes, Evan thought with a pang. "You leave my daddy alone," she declared, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that only children can manage. "He's a hero. He fixes everything, our neighbor's heater when she couldn't afford a repairman, the playground equipment at my school when the city said there was no budget, the van for the family down the street so they could visit their sick grandma. He makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the whole world, and he reads to me every night, even when he's tired, and he knows how to braid hair in 17 different ways because YouTube videos taught him after mommy went to heaven." The crowd, already primed for drama, melted entirely. Several people were openly crying. The teenager streaming was providing commentary through her own tears. "I can't handle this. This baby is really out here defending her father against corporate assassins." She said 17 different braids. 17. This man learned 17 braids for his daughter. "I'm literally deceased. Someone call Netflix because this needs to be a movie immediately." Evan lifted Lily into his arms, feeling the familiar weight of her, the way she fit perfectly against his shoulder, the smell of her strawberry shampoo mixed with playground dust and crayon wax. "It's okay, Lilypad," he murmured. "Everything's okay." "No, it's not," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "These bad men were being mean to that lady, and you stopped them because that's what you do. You fix things and protect people, and you never take credit for it, but I see it, Daddy. I see everything you do." She pulled something from her pocket, a red thread, one of the last pieces from Sarah's sweater. With the solemnity of a ritual, she wrapped it around his wrist where the first one had broken during the confrontation, tying it with 3 careful knots while whispering her protection spell in Spanish, the counting that Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her that she'd turned into magic. "There," she announced. "Now you're protected again." The police arrived in a cacophony of sirens and radio chatter, uniformed officers flooding into the restaurant with their hands on their weapons until they realized the situation was already contained. Evan handed over his phone, showing the 911 call he'd placed the moment he'd approached the table, every word of the confrontation recorded. He pointed out the security cameras, at least 12 angles that would have captured everything. He gave his statement calmly, professionally, still holding Lily, who refused to let go of his neck. The 3 men were separated, handcuffed, and led away. The large man was still cradling his paralyzed hand, which would require medical attention before booking. The thin man had custard in his hair and murder in his eyes. The silver-haired man maintained his dignity until the end, warning about lawyers and lawsuits and the mistake everyone was making, but his words fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, and the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Nadia approached Evan as the chaos began to settle, the restaurant staff attempting to restore some semblance of normal service despite the overturned dessert cart and the circus atmosphere. "You saved my life," she said softly. "And this evidence, it's going to save others. Bring justice to families who've been waiting for 5 years." "My wife died at Ashford Street," Evan said, the words coming out steadier than he'd expected. Nadia's face went white, her professional composure cracking. "Oh my God, Sarah Hale. She's mentioned throughout the documents. She was trying to report the violations. They fired her the week before the fire for creating a hostile work environment by insisting on safety repairs." The revelation hit Evan like a physical blow. Sarah had been fired? She'd never told him, had kissed him goodbye that last morning like everything was normal, had promised to bring home Chinese food for dinner. She'd been fighting to save lives, and it had cost her everything. "There are emails," Nadia continued, her voice urgent now, "from the CEO himself, saying that Sarah Hale was a problem that needed to be handled. I don't think they meant. But the fire happened so soon after." "Daddy, why are you crying?" Lily's voice was small, worried. "Sometimes daddies cry when they learn important things," he managed. "These are complicated tears, baby." The story exploded across the media landscape like a wildfire of its own. Within an hour, the video clips from La Mer were everywhere, the maintenance worker standing up to corporate muscle, the improvised weapons mastery, the little girl's fierce defense of her father. But it was the reveal of Evan's identity that transformed a viral moment into a cultural phenomenon. Someone leaked his gray line background, how Evan Hale had been one of the most elite diplomatic security trainers in the country, teaching de-escalation and non-lethal restraint to embassy guards and Secret Service agents. He'd walked away from a 6-figure consulting career after Sarah's death, choosing to raise his daughter on a maintenance worker's salary, rather than travel the world teaching others how to protect dignitaries he no longer cared about. The juxtaposition was irresistible to the 24-hour news cycle, the humble janitor who was secretly Jason Bourne, the single father who'd given up everything for his daughter, the working-class hero who'd taken down corporate villains with a broken spoon and a napkin. Every angle was analyzed, every detail scrutinized, every moment replayed with commentary from experts who explained the technical precision of Evan's moves and the psychological mastery of his de-escalation attempt before violence became necessary. But it was Lily who became the unexpected star. Her defense of her father, her precise enumeration of his quiet acts of kindness, her ritual with the red thread, it all combined to create a narrative that transcended political divisions. Here was a father who'd learned 17 ways to braid hair. Here was a daughter who made magic from her dead mother's sweater. Here was a family that had survived tragedy and chosen kindness over bitterness. The federal investigation that had been slowly building against Ravenfield Corporation suddenly found itself with unlimited resources and public pressure. The USB drive Nadia had risked her life to protect contained emails explicitly discussing the cost-benefit analysis of safety violations versus lawsuit settlements. There were recorded phone calls where executives laughed about acceptable losses among residents who wouldn't be missed. There was a spreadsheet that calculated the precise number of deaths they could financially absorb before repairs became cost-effective. The Ashford Street fire was documented in damning detail. Sarah Hale's termination was there, along with her formal safety complaints that had been systematically ignored. The fire itself was discussed in emails sent the next morning, before the death toll was even final, with executives more concerned about containing the media narrative than the families who'd lost everything. Within a week, 17 Ravenfield executives were arrested in coordinated dawn raids that the media covered like a sporting event. The CEO was caught at a private airfield with a go-bag containing $2 million in cash and diamonds, multiple passports, and a ticket to a non-extradition country. The CFO was pulled from his daughter's wedding reception. The head of building operations was arrested at his country club, hauled away in handcuffs while his golf partners watched in shock. The company's stock price collapsed. Trading was halted 3 times in a single day as it fell through floor after floor of support. Buildings across 5 states were immediately inspected by federal teams, revealing violations so extensive that many were evacuated on the spot. The cost of repairs would run into the billions, money Ravenfield no longer had as lawsuits poured in from every direction. La Mer restaurant found itself under its own investigation. The manager, it turned out, had been taking bribes from Ravenfield to allow their fixers to use his establishment for intimidation meetings. The safety violations Evan had noticed during his maintenance work were just the beginning. The kitchen was a death trap of jury-rigged equipment, bypassed safety systems, and ignored maintenance. The place was shut down within 48 hours, its license revoked, its reputation destroyed. When La Mer was sold to new owners a month later, they approached Evan with an offer. Head of safety and security, a salary that would triple his income, a position that would put him in charge of ensuring nothing like the Ravenfield incident ever happened again. Evan turned them down politely but firmly, sitting in their temporary office with Lily on his lap because school was closed for a teacher development day. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I already have a job." "We'll quadruple your current salary," the new owner insisted. "Full benefits, flexible hours, whatever you need." "I fix things," Evan replied. "That's what I do. That's what I'm good at. Your restaurant is just one place. There are hundreds of buildings in this city where people work and live that need someone to maintain their systems, to keep them safe. I can't do that sitting in an office." "Daddy fixes everything," Lily added helpfully. "Yesterday, he fixed our neighbor's wheelchair ramp, and last week he fixed the heating at the community center, and tomorrow he's going to fix the library's air conditioning because story time is too hot and kids get cranky when they're sweaty." They compromised. Evan would consult for them monthly, inspect their systems, train their staff on safety protocols, but he'd keep his regular job, keep his schedule that let him pick Lily up from school, keep the life they'd built together in their small apartment above the dry cleaner. The federal trial of the Ravenfield executives became the most watched corporate criminal case in a generation. Every major news outlet sent their best courtroom reporters. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Social media created memes from courtroom sketches. The families of the victims sat in the gallery every day, maintaining their vigil for justice that was 5 years overdue. When it came time for Evan to testify, he entered the courtroom in his gray work uniform. 3 different legal teams had offered to buy him suits, to polish his image for the cameras, but he'd declined them all. This was who he was, a maintenance worker, a father, a widower. He wouldn't pretend to be anything else. The prosecutor walked him through the events at La Mer, the confrontation, the revelation about the evidence. Evan answered simply, directly, without embellishment. Yes, he had intervened. Yes, he had used force when the men became violent. Yes, he had prior training that allowed him to subdue them without causing permanent injury. No, he had no regrets. Mr. Hale, the defense attorney said during cross-examination, a sharp-featured woman in a suit that probably cost more than Evan made in a month. You had a personal vendetta against my client's company, didn't you? Your wife died in the Ashford Street fire. My wife died because your clients decided safety repairs weren't cost-effective, Evan replied calmly. Objection, the attorney said immediately. Non-responsive. Sustained, the judge said, though his expression suggested he'd wanted to hear more. Let me rephrase, the attorney continued. You had a personal interest in seeing Ravenfield Corporation destroyed. I had a personal interest in the truth, Evan said. 23 people died because of decisions made in boardrooms by people who never had to see the consequences. My wife was one of them, but she wasn't the only one. Every one of those 23 people had family, friends, lives that mattered. They deserved justice. So you appointed yourself judge and jury? I stopped 3 men from assaulting a woman. The evidence she carried did the rest. When his testimony was complete, Evan did something unexpected. He pulled a red thread from his pocket, one of the last from Sarah's sweater, and tied it carefully around the USB drive that contained the evidence, the exhibit that would convict 17 executives of crimes ranging from negligent homicide to conspiracy. Then he placed one of Lily's paper cranes on top, a small blue bird she'd folded that morning from the newspaper coverage of the trial. The courtroom fell silent, confused by the gesture. The judge leaned forward, about to ask if the witness had something to add, when Lily stood up in the gallery. My daddy doesn't need words, she said, her clear voice carrying through the courtroom. The thread is my mommy's protection, to keep the truth safe. The crane is hope, because we make them every day to remember that beautiful things can come from flat, boring paper if you're patient and careful. And the drive is justice, which doesn't need anything else to be powerful. The image the USB drive wrapped in red thread, topped with a paper crane, presented by a silent man in a work uniform, became the defining photograph of the trial. It appeared on every front page, every news site, every social media platform. The symbolism was impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. The working class presenting evidence against corporate killers, protected by love and lifted by hope. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The Ravenfield executives were sentenced to a combined 312 years in prison. The company was forced into bankruptcy, its assets liquidated to pay settlements to the victims' families. The CEO got 40 years, eligible for parole in 25 if he survived that long. The CFO got 30. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. It wasn't enough, nothing could bring back the dead, but it was justice, or as close to justice as the legal system could provide. The settlements, when they finally came through, were substantial. The Ashford Street families would each receive millions, money that couldn't replace what they'd lost, but could at least ensure they wouldn't suffer financially on top of their grief. Evan's settlement was the largest, both because Sarah had been an employee attempting to report violations and because of his high-profile role in bringing the company down. He could have quit working immediately, could have moved to the suburbs, or even bought a house outright. He could have put Lily in private school, bought a new car, transformed their entire existence. Instead, he paid off their apartment, set up a college fund that would let Lily go anywhere she wanted, and donated a significant portion to a foundation that helped families affected by corporate negligence. He kept the rest in conservative investments, ensuring they'd never have to worry about money but not letting it change who they were. "Why, Daddy?" Lily asked one evening as they sat at their small kitchen table, folding paper cranes from origami paper misses. Rodriguez had bought them proper paper in every color, not the scraps they'd been using for years. "We could live in a big house with a pool." Evan considered his words carefully. How did you explain to a 7-year-old that money couldn't buy what mattered? That visibility came with a cost? That there was honor in the life they'd built, even if it wasn't the life he'd once imagined? "You know how we fix things?" he said finally. She nodded, her fingers never stopping their careful folding. "Some things need to stay a little broken," he said. "Not because they can't be fixed, but because the cracks remind us of what we've survived. This apartment, this neighborhood, this life, it's got cracks. But we earned every crack. We survived every break, and that makes it stronger than something that's never been tested. Like the spoon," she said, pointing to the cracked porcelain spoon that now sat in a place of honor on their shelf, glued back together but with the break still visible. "It's broken, but it still works. Exactly like the spoon." She thought about this, then held up her completed crane, a perfect purple bird that caught the light from their old overhead fixture. "Mommy would be proud of us, wouldn't she? For staying ourselves even when we could be different people? She would be so proud," Evan said, his throat tight. "She always said that who you are matters more than what you have." "I miss her," Lily said simply. "Me too, baby. Every day." But we have the cranes, and the threads, and each other. That's everything that matters. Life settled into a new rhythm that looked much like the old one from the outside. Evan still woke at 5:30 to get ready for work. Lily still tied a red thread around his wrist each morning, though now they had to buy red thread from the craft store since Sarah's sweater was finally gone. He still worked his routes through the city, fixing what was broken, maintaining what others took for granted. But there were changes, subtle ones. The other maintenance workers treated him differently now, with a mixture of respect and confusion. He was famous, but still punched a clock. He could have been anything but chose to remain what he was. Some thought he was crazy. Others understood that there was a dignity in the choice, a statement about the value of honest work. His supervisor, Marcus, had offered him a promotion to management 3 times. Each time, Evan had declined politely. "You could run this whole department," Marcus said during the 3rd attempt. "Hell, you could run the whole company." "Then who would fix the machines?" Evan asked. "We'd hire people. People like me. People who do the actual work. And then I'd be sitting in an office, managing spreadsheets instead of maintaining systems. And the only thing that would change is that I'd see Lily less and fix things never." Marcus shook his head but stopped asking. The fame from the Lawmare incident and trial faded gradually, as fame always does when not actively maintained. The interview requests slowed, then stopped. The book offers were politely declined. The documentary crews were turned away. Evan had no interest in reliving the worst day of his life for entertainment, no matter how it was framed. But in certain circles, he remained a legend. In the community of maintenance workers and service staff, he was the one who'd stood up, who'd proved that invisible didn't mean powerless. In the neighborhood, he was the man who fixed things for free when people couldn't afford repairs, who taught kids basic maintenance skills, who showed up when things went wrong. And to Lily, he was still just Daddy, the man who braided her hair in increasingly complex patterns, he was up to 23 styles now, who read to her every night, who made grilled cheese sandwiches with exactly the right amount of butter and cheese, who protected her from nightmares and mean kids and the fear that everyone she loved would disappear like her mother had. One evening, 6 months after the trial, they sat on their fire escape watching the sun set over the city. The skyline was changing, old buildings torn down, new ones rising, the constant cycle of urban renewal. But their block remained stubbornly unchanged, populated by people who worked with their hands and measured wealth in relationships rather than bank balances. "Daddy," Lily said, leaning against his shoulder, "do you think Mommy knows what happened, about the bad men going to jail?" "I think she knows," Evan said carefully. "I think she knows that the truth finally came out." "Good." She worried about things. She would want to know it was fixed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness fell. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted up, Mrs. Rodriguez's television, the Brennan family's dinnertime chaos, the teenagers playing basketball in the alley, the rumble of buses, and the distant wail of sirens that provided the city's constant soundtrack. "We did good, didn't we, Daddy?" Lily said finally. "We helped people." "You did good," Evan corrected. "You were brave enough to run into that restaurant. You stood up to those men. You told the truth about who we are." "We're fixers," she said proudly. "We fix broken things." "That's right. What will we fix tomorrow?" Evan smiled, thinking about his work order for the next day, a hotel with a failing HVAC system, a restaurant with a walk-in freezer that kept icing over, a school with drinking fountains that wouldn't stop running. Small problems in the grand scheme of things, but important to the people affected by them. "Everything we can," he said, "one broken thing at a time." As they climbed back through the window into their apartment, Lily went immediately to her supply table to prepare tomorrow's red thread. She'd developed a system now, different knots for different days, special patterns for important occasions. Tomorrow was Friday, which meant a 4-knot braid that she'd learned from a library book about sailing. Evan watched her work, this remarkable child who'd survived loss and chosen hope, who made paper birds to connect with a mother she barely remembered, who believed that red thread could protect against all the world's dangers. She was growing so fast already she could reach the middle shelf without standing on tiptoes. Already she was reading books meant for 5th graders. Already she was asking questions about justice and fairness that he struggled to answer. The news played quietly on their old television, another corporate scandal, another set of victims seeking justice, another cycle of power and consequence. But Evan wasn't watching. He was helping Lily with her math homework, the two of them bent over her workbook at the kitchen table, working through problems about trains leaving stations and pools being filled with water. "These problems are silly," Lily declared. "Nobody needs to know when 2 trains will meet. They have schedules. But you need to know how to solve problems," Evan explained. "Even silly ones. Because once you can solve the silly ones, you can solve the real ones. Like you solved the problem at the restaurant? That was different." "No, it wasn't." You saw what was wrong, you figured out how to fix it, and you did the work. That's what you always say: see it, solve it, do it. She wasn't wrong. Everything was a problem to be solved if you broke it down into components. 3 men threatening a woman solve for removing the threat. A corporation avoiding justice solve for exposing the truth. A daughter needing her father solve for being present, always. After Lily was asleep, her room glowing softly from the nightlight shaped like a crane that someone had sent after the trial, Evan sat in the living room surrounded by thousands of paper birds. They hung from the ceiling on fishing line, covered every surface, filled boxes and jars. 5 years of daily folding, a meditation on grief and hope that had become as essential as breathing. He picked up the cracked spoon from its place on the shelf, running his fingers along the glued break. Tomorrow he would go to work. He would fix machines that others had broken or neglected. He would come home to Lily, to homework and dinner and bedtime stories. He would add more cranes to their collection, more days to their survival, more small repairs to the broken world. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, an emergency call at a hospital, their backup generators failing during a test. Evan stood, wrote a note for Mrs. Rodriguez about watching Lily, and grabbed his tool bag. Even at 10 at night, even when he was tired, there was work to be done. There were always things that needed fixing. As he headed for the door, he paused at Lily's room, watching her sleep. She'd fallen asleep with a book on her chest, something about a girl who saved her village by being clever and brave. Her face was peaceful, unmarked by the worries that would eventually find her, still believing that the world could be fixed if you just worked hard enough at it. Tomorrow, he whispered to the darkness, to Sarah's memory, to the uncertain future, we fix something else. And they would. They always did. One broken thing at a time, one small repair after another, until maybe, eventually, the world would be a little less broken for everyone. It wasn't a grand ambition, it wasn't a heroic quest. It was just work, constant, necessary, invisible work that kept everything running. But sometimes, Evan thought as he headed out into the night toward the hospital and its failing generators, sometimes the small fixes added up to something bigger. Sometimes a broken spoon and a red thread could bring down a corporation. Sometimes a maintenance man could save a journalist. Sometimes a 7-year-old could remind an entire city that heroes came in work uniforms as often as they came in capes. The city stretched out before him, millions of lights and millions of windows, each one representing someone with their own problems, their own broken things that needed fixing. He couldn't fix them all, but he could fix what was in front of him, what his hands could reach, what his tools could repair. That would have to be enough, and somehow it was. What if the billionaire martial artist wasn't the strongest in the room? The question would have seemed absurd to anyone watching Clara Vance enter the Riverside dojo that September evening. Her presence preceded her like thunder before lightning, the click of Italian leather against worn wood, the subtle rustle of a jacket worth more than most cars, the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around her authority. 8 years of building a tech empire hadn't softened the edges her Aikido training had sharpened. If anything, the boardroom had made her more dangerous. She moved through space like she owned it, because usually she did. The dojo's fluorescent lights caught the silver threading in her dark hair, pulled back in a bun so severe it could cut glass. Students preparing for evening practice paused mid-stretch, their bodies instinctively straightening as if she were a general inspecting troops. Clara didn't acknowledge them. Her attention fixed on the lone figure mopping the corner near the weapons rack, a man whose presence was so unremarkable that most people's eyes simply slid past him like water over stone. Daniel Cross worked his mop in patient circles, each movement deliberate, economical. His flannel shirt, faded from countless washes, hung loose on a frame that suggested strength without advertising it. Where Clara commanded attention, Daniel seemed to actively deflect it, as if he'd learned that invisibility was its own form of armor. "You missed a spot," Clara said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown executives sweat through their presentations. Daniel didn't look up. The floor doesn't mind waiting. Something in his tone, not defiance exactly, but a complete absence of deference, made Clara's spine straighten further, if such a thing were possible. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across his work like a challenge. "Do you know who I am?" Now Daniel did look up, and Clara found herself staring into eyes the color of winter storms, gray, patient, holding depths she hadn't expected. Someone who thinks the floor cares about your resume. The dojo fell silent. Even the wall clock seemed to pause its ticking. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she couldn't name, like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. "Would you like to spar?" The words came out before she could examine them, sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. Daniel considered this, wringing his mop with the same unhurried care he applied to everything. only if you promise not to cry. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological time. Clara Vance, who had made venture capitalists weep and crushed hostile takeovers before breakfast, stood frozen in the middle of a community dojo, staring at a janitor who had just delivered the most unexpected counterstrike of her life. Clara's usual response would have been swift, cutting, designed to re-establish dominance. But something in Daniel's eyes, not mockery, not challenge, but a kind of ancient knowing, kept her words locked in her throat. She turned on her heel and walked to the changing room, her footsteps echoing like a countdown to something she couldn't yet name. The next evening, Clara returned earlier, ostensibly to practice forms before the crowd arrived. But her eyes kept drifting to Daniel as he prepared the space-checking mats for tiers, ensuring weapons were properly secured, moving through his tasks with a quality of attention that made each mundane action seem almost meditative. There was something in the way he moved that didn't match the story his clothes told. His body knew things, old things, earned things, the kind of knowledge that came from places darker than any boardroom. A small boy sat in the corner, maybe 7 years old, sketching in a notebook with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgeons or demolition experts. His hair, the same storm cloud color as Daniel's, fell across his forehead as he worked. Every few minutes, he would look up at his father, as if confirming something, then return to his drawing. "That's Ethan," Master Yamamoto said, appearing beside Clara with his usual talent for materialization. "Daniel's son, quiet boy, sees things." "Sees things?" The old master's eyes crinkled, the kind of things we spend years learning not to see. As if summoned by the conversation, Ethan stood and walked toward Clara with the purposeful stride of someone carrying something important. He stopped just outside her personal space, close enough to be bold, far enough to be respectful, and held out a piece of paper. Clara took it, expecting a child's drawing of stick figures or rainbow houses. Instead, she found herself looking at a woman standing in rain, rendered with surprising skill. The woman's face was turned skyward, and where the rain touched her, she seemed to be dissolving, becoming part of the storm itself. But it wasn't sadness in the figure's posture, it was something else, something Clara couldn't quite name. "This is," Clara began, then stopped. "Did you draw this just now?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "You look like rain sounds." Before Clara could process this cryptic observation, Daniel appeared, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan, Miss Vance is here to train, not to review your art portfolio." "She needed to see it," Ethan said, with the certainty children possess before the world teaches them doubt. Daniel's eyes met Clara's over his son's head, and she saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps, or warning. Ethan sees what he sees. "I've learned not to argue with it." Clara looked down at the drawing again, and suddenly she was 17, standing on a mountain in Colorado, rain turning to sleet, her brother Sam's hand slipping from hers, his scream swallowed by the storm. She forced the memory down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 18 years perfecting that particular motion. "It's very good," she managed, handing the drawing back. But Ethan didn't take it. "It's yours, for when you remember how to get wet." The boy returned to his corner, leaving Clara holding a piece of paper that suddenly weighed more than any contract she'd ever signed. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his work, but not before she caught something in his expression, not pity, which would have been unbearable, but understanding, which was somehow worse. That night, Clara stood in her penthouse office, 40 floors above the city, the drawing spread on her desk between quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, and she found herself tracing the figure's dissolving outline with one finger. Her phone buzzed with messages from Beijing, from London, from a dozen fires that needed her attention, but she couldn't look away from a 7-year-old's interpretation of something she'd never told anyone. The memory came anyway, despite all her fortifications. Sam, 2 years younger, always trying to keep up, always pushing himself to match his sister's relentless pace. The storm had come from nowhere, turning their easy climb into a nightmare of ice and wind. She could have turned back, should have turned back. But Clara Vance didn't retreat, didn't fail, didn't show weakness. So she'd pushed forward, and Sam had followed, because that's what Sam did, followed his sister into any challenge, any danger, trusting her completely. The ice gave way under his feet with a sound like breaking bones. His hand in hers for one eternal second, his eyes wide with surprise more than fear, and then nothing but the scream of wind and the scream from her throat and the endless, endless falling. The authorities called it an accident. The mountain was unpredictable, the storm unprecedented. No one's fault. But Clara knew better. She'd chosen pride over safety, image over intuition. Sam had paid the price for her need to be invincible. She'd built her empire on that guilt, each success a brick in a wall between herself and that moment on the mountain. The Aikido training had come later, a way to control her body as ruthlessly as she controlled her emotions, to never again be at the mercy of weakness or hesitation. She'd risen through the ranks with mechanical precision, each belt another layer of armor, until she stood where she stood now, untouchable, unbeatable, and utterly alone. The drawing stared up at her, and Clara realized what Ethan had captured that she'd missed at first glance. The dissolving wasn't destruction, it was integration. The woman wasn't being destroyed by the rain, she was becoming part of it, letting it through instead of standing against it. Her phone rang. Tokyo. Important. She let it go to voicemail. The next evening at the dojo, Clara arrived to find the space fuller than usual. Master Yamamoto had invited a visiting instructor, Sensei Hartwell from the Seattle school, a man whose reputation preceded him like a red carpet he'd rolled out himself. Hartwell stood in the center of the mat, his voice carrying the kind of artificial depth men developed when they confused volume with authority. Excellence in Aikido, he was saying, requires complete dedication. It's not something one can pursue casually, between other obligations. His eyes landed on Daniel, who was adjusting the equipment closet door that had been sticking for months. Some people understand that the martial arts demand everything. Others, well, they mop floors. The students shifted uncomfortably. Several glanced at Daniel, who continued working on the door, apparently oblivious to the insult. Clara felt something hot rise in her chest, not embarrassment for Daniel, but anger at Hartwell's casual cruelty, his need to elevate himself by stepping on someone else. Daniel finished with the door, tested it twice, then turned to face Hartwell with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. True, he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. I mop floors. But I don't mop egos. That seems like harder work. The silence that followed had weight, substance, the kind that pressed against eardrums. Hartwell's face went through several colors, none of them healthy. Master Yamamoto covered what might have been a smile with his hand. Perhaps, Hartwell said, recovering his composure with visible effort, you'd like to demonstrate your expertise? Show us all what wisdom comes from? Janitorial excellence? Daniel shrugged. I'm good with the floor being clean. It doesn't need to be anything more than it is. Spoken like someone who's never pushed himself toward greatness, Hartwell sneered. Or someone who's learned the cost of pushing too hard, Daniel replied, and for the first time, Clara heard steel beneath the silk of his voice. She found herself stepping forward before she'd made the decision to move. I'll spar with him. Every head turned. Hartwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish discovering air wasn't water. Master Yamamoto's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Miss Vance, Hartwell began, surely you don't want to waste your time. I don't waste anything, Clara cut him off. Daniel, would you mind? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing something, measuring not her challenge but something deeper. Finally, he nodded. Let me change. When he emerged from the changing room, Clara understood what she'd been sensing all along. The comfortable flannel was gone, replaced by a gi that had seen better decades. But it was the way he wore it, not like a costume or even a uniform, but like a second skin he'd never quite shed. His movements had changed too, or rather, revealed themselves. The careful invisibility was still there, but now she could see it for what it was. Not absence, but presence so complete, it didn't need announcement. They faced each other on the mat, bowed, and Clara attacked with the precision that had earned her 8 Dan, a level most people never reached, achieved through years of relentless practice and perfect technique. Daniel moved like water finding its way down a mountain, not avoiding her strikes, but accepting them, redirecting them, turning her force into empty air. He didn't counterattack, didn't try to dominate. He simply existed in the space her violence created, filling it with something that wasn't violence at all. She increased her speed, her power, drawing on techniques that had humbled practitioners with decades of experience. Daniel matched her without matching her, met her without meeting her. It was like fighting smoke, or music, or the idea of resistance rather than resistance itself. And throughout it all, his eyes never left hers, and what she saw there wasn't triumph or strain, but something infinitely more disturbing: compassion. The spar ended when Clara realized she was crying. Not sobbing, not breaking down, but tears running down her face as she moved, as if Daniel's patient acceptance had found cracks in her armor she didn't know existed. She stepped back, bowed, and walked off the mat without a word. In the changing room, she sat on the bench and tried to understand what had just happened. She'd sparred with masters who'd devoted their lives to the art, and none had done what Daniel had just done, shown her how much energy she wasted on winning, on being better, on maintaining the walls she'd built. A soft knock on the doorframe. Miss Vance? Daniel's voice, careful but not cautious. Are you all right? How? She asked without looking up. How did you learn to move like that? Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he might have left. Then, I was a firefighter, 15 years. You learn pretty quick that fighting fire doesn't work. You have to move with it, understand it, respect it. Then one day, a building came down wrong. My wife was inside, part of the search team. He paused, and Clara heard years of practice in that pause, the sound of someone who'd learned to carry weight without showing it. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pretend I was fighting anything. Ethan needed a father more than the city needed another hero who thought he could beat back chaos. So now I mop floors, and I raise my son, and I practice not fighting with things that don't need to be fought. Clara looked up then, met his eyes. I'm sorry about your wife. Her name was Rachel, Daniel said. She laughed like morning felt. Ethan has her smile when he uses it. And you? Clara asked. What do you have of hers? Daniel considered this, the knowledge that some things are worth being broken for, and that being broken isn't the same as being beaten. He left then, and Clara sat in the changing room until the dojo emptied, until the lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, until she could trust herself to walk to her car without shattering. The next week, Clara threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if she could bury what had happened at the dojo under enough spreadsheets and conference calls. But every time she passed the window, she saw rain that wasn't there. Every time she signed a document, she remembered Daniel's hands, patient and sure. And every night, Ethan's drawing stared at her from her desk, a child's prophecy she couldn't decode or discard. Thursday arrived with actual rain, the kind that turned the city into an impressionist painting. Clara stood before the dojo, her umbrella unopened in her hand, water running down her face. She'd come to teach the advanced class, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't know the forms, didn't understand the principles. Inside, the students waited. She began the class, demonstrating a technique she'd performed thousands of times. But when she grabbed the practice partner's wrist, she was suddenly on the mountain again, Sam's hand in hers, slipping. Her grip tightened. The student winced. You're hurting me, the student said quietly. Clara released him as if burned. The room spun. She heard her own voice, hollow and strange, making some excuse. Then she was in the hallway, her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her designer suit crumpling against institutional tile. The floor's already crying. Daniel's voice came from above her. No need to add to it. She looked up to find him standing there with his mop and bucket, but his eyes held no mockery. He sat down beside her, not touching, just present, the way a lighthouse is present for ships in storms, not reaching out, but constantly saying, here is solid ground. I killed my brother, Clara said, the words falling out like stones she'd swallowed 18 years ago. I pushed him to climb in a storm because I couldn't bear to turn back, couldn't bear to fail. He fell. He died. Because I had to win against a mountain. Daniel didn't say it wasn't her fault, didn't offer platitudes about forgiveness or moving on. He just sat there, letting her truth exist in the space between them without trying to fix it or file it away. How do you stand it? She asked. The weight? I don't, Daniel said simply. I carry it. There's a difference. Standing is what you do against something. Carrying is what you do with something. Rachel's death is part of me now, woven through everything like thread through cloth. Pull it out, and the whole thing unravels. So I carry it, and I let it make me softer instead of harder, because that's what Ethan needs, a father who knows how to bend without breaking. Clara felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking but opening, like a door sealed shut so long she'd forgotten it was a door. The tears came then, real tears, the kind she hadn't cried since that day on the mountain. Daniel didn't comfort her, didn't touch her, just sat there being solid while she became liquid, while 18 years of ice melted into salt water on a dojo floor. When the tears finally stopped, she found a small yellow paper crane beside her knee. She looked up to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his young face serious as a priest's. You were loud, he said solemnly, because you were scared of being quiet. But quiet is where the soft things live. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her holding a paper crane that weighed nothing and everything. 3 days later, Clara knocked on Daniel's apartment door. It was a modest building in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place her driver had trouble finding because it didn't appear on any of the maps her world used. Daniel answered in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, looking somehow more himself than she'd ever seen him. I brought forms, Clara said, holding up a folder. Volunteer forms, to be an assistant instructor at the dojo. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. You want to volunteer, to assist. Teaching. I'm very good at forms, Clara said, hearing how absurd she sounded. The paperwork kind and the martial kind. A smile ghosted across Daniel's face. Come in, Ethan's making dinner. Fair warning, he believes spaghetti is a food group. The apartment was small, clean, lived in. Photos covered one wall. Daniel younger, laughing, his arms around a woman whose smile could have powered cities. Ethan at various ages, always with that same serious expression, as if he'd been born knowing things others had to learn. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable, everything chosen for use rather than appearance. Ethan stood on a step stool at the stove, stirring a pot with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. He looked up when Clara entered, nodded as if he'd been expecting her, then returned to his work. "She can stay," he announced. "She knows about the crane now." Daniel shot Clara an apologetic look. "Ethan has strong opinions about dinner guests." "Only the ones who matter," Ethan corrected, not looking up from his pot. Clara felt that strange cracking sensation in her chest again, like light finding its way through boards. She set her folder on the counter, rolled up her designer sleeves, and asked, "What can I do to help?" Ethan handed her a wooden spoon without hesitation. "Stir counterclockwise. The noodles get dizzy otherwise." For the first time in 18 years, Clara laughed, really laughed, not the practiced sound she used in boardrooms, but something that came from the same deep place the tears had found. Daniel smiled, and Ethan nodded approvingly, and Clara stirred counterclockwise while the noodles found their balance. Over dinner, eaten at a table that wobbled until Daniel stuck a folded paper under one leg, Clara discovered what she'd been missing in her penthouse with its perfect views and profound emptiness. Ethan talked about school, about a turtle they'd seen in the park, about why clouds looked angry sometimes but were really just heavy. Daniel listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed he found his son's observations as important as any board meeting. They included Clara naturally, as if she'd always been there, as if there was a her-shaped space at their table that had been waiting to be filled. "This is the part where you bow," Ethan said suddenly, holding out a folded piece of paper. Clara took it, unfolded it carefully. Inside, in Ethan's careful handwriting, "Home isn't where you're biggest, it's where you fit." She looked at the boy, this strange, wise child who seemed to see through time itself. "How do you know these things?" Ethan shrugged. "I watch. Most people are so busy being loud they can't hear what the quiet is saying, but you're learning to listen now. Dad taught me that how to listen to the spaces between sounds." Daniel reached over and ruffled his son's hair. "You're getting philosophical again, buddy. Save some wisdom for dessert." "Ice cream isn't wise," Ethan said seriously. "It's just happy." And it was. They ate ice cream from mismatched bowls, and Clara learned that Daniel had been teaching Ethan Aikido since he could walk, not the forms but the principles, how to move with force rather than against it, how to find balance in motion, how to fall without fear. She learned that Ethan drew every day, that Daniel read to him every night, that they went to the park every Sunday to feed ducks who, according to Ethan, had very strong opinions about bread. When it was time to leave, Clara stood at the door, reluctant to return to her pristine space in the sky. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, handed her another paper crane, this one blue. "For your desk," he said. "So you remember you can be small and still fly." Walking to her car, Clara realized she'd left the volunteer forms on Daniel's counter. It didn't matter. She'd be back. She was back the next day, and the next. Not to the apartment. Daniel had boundaries, and she respected them, but to the dojo, where she began assisting with the children's classes. The kids were suspicious at first. She was too polished, too precise, too much like the adults who usually disappointed them. But Ethan vouched for her in his serious way, and gradually they accepted her presence, then her help, then her. She and Daniel began training together after the official classes ended. Not sparring exactly, more like moving meditation, finding the spaces where their different styles could coexist. Clara's Aikido was all technique, perfect angles, and precisely applied force. Daniel's was something else, intuition made physical, a conversation with energy itself. When they moved together, something new emerged, neither his nor hers but theirs, a dialect of motion they were inventing as they went. "You're thinking too much," Daniel would say when she tried to force a technique. "You're not thinking enough," she'd counter when his intuition led him into awkward positions. But gradually, session by session, they found a middle way. Clara learned to trust her body's knowledge. Daniel learned to appreciate the beauty of perfect form. They pushed each other without competing, challenged without conquering. Ethan would sit in his corner, drawing, occasionally offering observations that sounded like nonsense but always proved profound. "You're trying to be the same river. Now you're both water. This is the part where you stop being two." One evening, after a particularly fluid session, they sat on the edge of the mat, breathing hard, sweat making them both more human than their daily roles allowed. Daniel's hand rested on the mat near hers, not touching but present, a possibility rather than a fact. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Clara asked. "About your training, your background. You could teach, really teach, not just assist." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Ethan add details to his latest drawing. "After Rachel died, I realized how much of my life I'd spent being visible, the hero firefighter, the dedicated husband, the man who ran toward danger. But all that visibility, all that being seen, it didn't save her. It didn't even help me see what mattered until it was gone. So I chose to become invisible, to do small things with great attention rather than great things with small attention. Ethan doesn't need a father who's a hero. He needs a father who's present. But you're extraordinary, Clara said, the words coming out more intense than she'd intended. Daniel turned to look at her fully, and she saw in his eyes a kindness that made her chest ache. So is everyone, if you look at them right. The janitor at your office who knows exactly how you take your coffee. The security guard who remembers every employee's birthday. We're all extraordinary in quiet ways. I just chose to stop shouting about it. A month passed. Clara found herself spending less time in her office, delegating more, trusting her team in ways that initially terrified then liberated her. She'd arrive at the dojo early, help Daniel set up, watch him work with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved anything. They didn't talk about what was growing between them, but it was there in the space between their bodies when they trained, in the way Ethan had started including her in his drawings, always as part of their unit, never separate. Then came the community demonstration. Master Yamamoto had organized it as a fundraiser for the youth program, but it had grown into something larger, a celebration of Aikido, of community, of the beauty possible when power served rather than dominated. The gymnasium was packed, folding chairs filled with families, local press, even some of Clara's business associates who'd come out of curiosity about what their fierce CEO did in her spare time. The demonstrations began with the children, Ethan among them, showing basic movements with the solemnity of tiny warriors. Then the intermediate students, competent but still finding their way. The advanced class performed complex techniques that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Then Master Yamamoto stood, his voice carrying despite his age. For our final demonstration, two of our most dedicated practitioners, Clara Vance, whose support has kept our doors open and our mission alive, and Daniel Cross, who ensures those doors open smoothly every day, in every way. The crowd's reaction was mixed recognition and excitement for Clara, polite confusion for Daniel. The janitor? Was this some kind of feel-good gesture? Clara and Daniel walked onto the mat from opposite sides, bowed to each other, and began. What followed couldn't properly be called a demonstration.